So watercolor is one of those mediums that is what you make of it. If you want to have something that is super high detailed and realistic, you can do that with watercolor. If you want something that's sporadic, you can do that too. And if you want something that creates itself, that's another aspect of watercolor that you either have to lean into or you have to learn to control. Watercolor is not like acrylic painting or oil painting. Watercolor acts like watercolor. It's different, and you're either going to love it or you're going to hate it. And there's not really any in between. Now, the good thing with watercolor, it's probably the cheapest style of painting that you can have. And what you need to get started with it is very simple. And in fact, all of my watercolors that I've ever done have been created with the supplies that I'm about to show you. To start off with learning watercolor, you don't really need a whole lot of supplies. The only things that you really need to start with is a set of watercolors, a brush, some water, paper obviously, as well as something to dry your brush with. Now you can use paper towels, but what I actually prefer is some old denim, because I feel like that this gives like a texture whenever you try and dab watercolor off, and it's also a lot more durable than paper towels, so whenever you clean your brushes out, this will last a lot longer, and you can just toss these in the wash whenever you get done and they're basically brand new, ready to go again. Now to start off, whenever you first start mixing with watercolor, a lot of times the first mistakes that people make is they wet their brush and they just scoop out a big chunk of paint and slap it on the paper. That is not what you do. Instead, whenever you paint with watercolor, you're not painting with the pigments. Instead, what you want to do, and I'm just mixing my brush around in the water right here, get it nice and wet, kind of tap it off on the side to let it drip down. And then we are going to be going into whatever color we want. For instance, let's do blue, and we are just putting this down, and I'm going to be rolling my paintbrush around while it is inside of the blue, and I'm just rolling it back and forth. And you're going to notice that you're going to start picking up pigments, and the pigment or the paint is going to be held in the bristles. So whenever you put this paint down, you can see that now you have the paint. If you hold the brush down and drag it across, you can get longer lines. You can pick it up and get thinner lines right there. So you can just use the tip here and get very thin lines. You can also roll the paintbrush around as you're painting to get more pigment out. Now what you don't want to do is just take your paintbrush and go like this all over the place and paint back and forth like you're doing acrylic painting. Instead, you want to pull and drag your brush like that. This technique that I have right here, this is a technique that is called wet on dry. Wet on dry is a technique where you take wet watercolor and you put it onto a dry piece of paper, and you can get very fine crisp lines as you see right here. Whenever you rinse out your brush, what you want to do is just put it in your water, rinse it around, tap it off on the side, and then you can take your rag, fold it around the bristles like that, and then pinch the bristles as you pull the brush out. Don't be trying to take it and just clean it like this, because with watercolor brushes, they need to be very fluid and they need to keep their point. That helps them store water and transfer water from the tip or from the barrel down to the tip. With wet on wet, you want to go ahead and take some of your water, preferably clean water, and you want to wet the paper first. The idea is that you are taking your wet paint and you're putting it onto a wet surface. And what this does is it allows the paint to disperse over all of the wet areas. So if we go right back into our blues again, we can roll that around. As you can see, I have reactivated the pigment, And now we can go back up here and I can just very lightly brush it across there. And you can see it is now spread to all those areas that were previously wet. Now you can take this a step further if you want and actually integrate in some colors. I have just cleaned off my brush. I'm going to go back in and I'm going to go over to a nice purple. Roll the paintbrush around, activate the pigments. We can go right in here and let's say just drop a few little splotches in there. And as you can see, it's starting to spread out. And this is actually a really great way that you can mix colors together to create really neat effects. You want the paint darker in some areas, you can do that. And this is the wet on wet technique. One more tip that all beginners should know is how to mix colors not on the paper, but instead mix it before it goes down. Now you can use a palette like this or one of these if you want to mix on, but most watercolor sets, especially the wells, actually come with an area right here that you can mix your colors on. Take some water, drop it down over here on an empty place on your palette, and it might take a few dips in your water to get enough water down for you. And then you can go into your pigments, start with one, roll it in, and then dip it over here. And what you want to do is you want to get enough pigments into your water that you can work with and you can blend and mix. Once you have this done, rinse out your brush and go right into your next color. You want to do the same thing, but this time you want to try and dilute this color as much as you can because you want to try and go back in as little as possible so you don't mix colors. You're going to be doing the color mixing over here. And then once you have enough, you can start mixing the colors together. Clean off the brush, go back into whatever pigments you want, and then add more to it. For this, I'm going to get a nice forest green, so I needed some green and blues, and then I'm going to go into some browns. And that is pretty much it. And now we get to the final part, and that is how to properly clean up. First off, I've already shown you how to clean the brush, but how do you clean off the palette? Well, the palette is actually pretty easy to clean. All you have to do is take your washcloth or your paper towel and just soak up the paint. And if it is not coming up, just get the paper towel or washcloth a little damp and then it cleans right up. Make sure that you do not take your paper towel into the pigments, because if you do that, you're going to take the whole thing up. If those pigments are wet, that's perfectly fine. Just leave them alone and they will dry out on their own. Close that back up. Try not to jostle this around too much and then put it in storage. For your paintbrush, the best way to store your paintbrush is to push the bristles down like that. And if you still have the protective sleeve that it came in, you can store them back in that. But if not, just make sure that you don't store it in a way that the bristles are going to be bending. How to properly store this back in the tubes: you make sure that all the bristles are down and slightly damp. That way they stick together. And then you put this tube in there and rotate it around like this while you're twisting your brush. That way you can see if you have any stray hairs that might get closed off. And when you don't, it just slides back in place. All you have to do with this is just pour it down the sink. Now, if you are part of my class, your assignment is going to be for today. We're going to be practicing with wet on wet technique, which is right up here. Wet on dry technique, which is over here. Mixing colors, which we previously did in the palette. And then finally cleaning up. We are going to be doing this lesson very quickly. It'll probably be a 1 to 2 day lesson. And we're going to be moving on into watercolor and a lot of techniques that go along with it. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.